which takes us to the item that we've just been discussing with the Ōrākei Local Board, and that is the Resource Management, so-called Enabling Housing Supply Amendment Bill, and that is on page 9 of our agenda. It's item 8, and this bill, as you now know, members, was sprung upon us by government out of the blue. This proposed piece of legislation on not just this council, but all the Tier 1 and 2 councils around the country that it affects. There was no consultation with Auckland, which is contrary to the memorandum of understanding that this council has with the on the joint working party of Crown and Council addressing housing and urban development issues in Auckland, which is disappointing. Now, there are 3 key things about this bill, so I'll just briefly summarise. I will also add that there was no pre-briefing of our staff or elected members on this bill prior to it being announced. There are 3 key things about this bill that we need to address. It intends to speed up implementation of the National Policy Statement Urban Development that was released last year. In some ways, it's a tidy up of that particular direction. Requires councils to rezone low intensification areas in a more dispersed density way, replacing that with a medium intensification zone, they say, and with new development standards. And it's somewhat similar to the mixed housing urban zone that we have in our Auckland Unitary Plan, though with differences. There's also the proposal of a streamlined process with new powers being conferred on the Minister for the Environment, with less opportunity for appeal. And the bill comes, as we all know, on the back of the MPSUD that I've just outlined in August 2020, the resource management reform, which we're yet to get into the thick of, freshwater management reform, we're engaged with that, climate plans, future of local government reform, 3 waters reforms, etc. So it will have implications for our city of Tāmaki, and it is critical that we make an informed decision, and then follow up that with a verbal presentation, and I would propose that the Mayor and I do that for the Council. So the purpose of this report today is to get delegated authority for a subgroup to sign off the submission. That will be shared in advance with all the Planning Committee members, and local board contributions will be amended and referred to in that submission. So members, in double quick time, our plans and places team, our regulatory team, water care, Auckland Transport, economists, the finance team, they've all come together. They've had to drop a lot of other work to focus on the submission. It's no mean task in such a short turnaround period as demanded by the government. But they are doing that work for us, and to outline that work, I will now hand over to John Dogood, the General Manager of Plans and Places, to take us through the work to date, the work ahead, and the paper and recommendations for us. John, in your good hands.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, members of the committee. Yeah, this presentation is really giving an overview of the bill. As the Chair mentioned, we've had just over a week to analyse the bill, so there's still quite a bit of analysis to undertake over the next week or so before the submission period closes. So just a bit of a caveat there that this is a preliminary sort of assessment, so as well as giving you a factual, very quick overview for those who haven't had the chance to read the bill or seen our short presentation that Megan and I circulated last week. And then we will just speak to, or I will speak to some preliminary thoughts that are sort of emerging from our team across the council family, as the Chair mentioned. So Kalinda has the controls. So 4 key aspects to the proposals in the bill. As Chair has mentioned, there is a requirement for Tier 1 councils. So those are the councils in the high growth cities in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So it's Christchurch, Wellington, Tauranga, Hamilton and Auckland regions. So there are more than just the 5 councils affected by this bill. But it's essentially requiring a new streamlined process for the submissions and hearings on the plan change that you'll be well aware that work is underway under the direction of the Planning Committee to have a plan change by next August that will see significant upzoning in Auckland and those other Tier 1 cities. So it's to sort of streamline the process from August onwards. I'll speak to that in a bit more detail shortly. Again, the Tier 1 councils are required to adopt what's referred to in the bill as medium density residential standards and put those out and have them come into effect next August. Third proposal is actually amending the National Policy Statement itself. And that's to deal with a topic that Planning Committee has considered at 2 or 3 workshops and given staff direction to get moving on aspects of intensification outside of the walkable catchments of the city centre, the 10 metro centres in Auckland and the rapid transit stations. So it's policy for those other parts of the urban area. So that's amended or would be amended by this bill. There's a point around defining what a planning decision is that does have some ramifications that I'll touch on. And lastly, just clarifying that financial contributions under the RMA can be levied on permitted activities, things that don't require resource consent under the unitary plan. So just to that first proposal, as briefly outlined in the agenda reports and in the video that Megan and I sent around last week to committee members and local boards and others, the intensification streamlined planning process, as it's referred to, we all either love or hate acronyms or just live with them. So we have quite a few acronyms in this bill, and apologies, I've got a few in this presentation. But the ISTP is essentially, it's similar to a streamlined process that's described in the RMA as it stands, and that was introduced a couple of years ago, with a key point being that there will be no right of appeal on this plan change next August to the Environment Court, so people can get involved, they can have the submission, turn up at a council hearing, but at that point the panel makes recommendations back to the council, so that's the middle box there. Independent submission, hearings panel. Auckland Council almost always uses an independent hearings panel in any case, so that's not a radical thing for Auckland. But normally we would have our panels make a decision. So what the bill is saying is that the panel won't be able to make a decision. It will be handed back to the Planning Committee or the governing body to make a decision. Council notifies that decision, and the last box is the key one, really. Where the council rejects something from this from its independent hearing commissioners in the way of this intensification plan change next August, it will be notified next August. The rejection would happen quite a bit after that. It then goes to the Minister for the Environment, who will simply make a decision. Well, it may not be a simple decision, but the Minister would have the authority to essentially make a decision as to whether Auckland Council or the other Tier 1 councils had made the right decision or not. And there will be no rights of appeal to the Environment Court at any step in this process. The only sort of appeal avenue would be a judicial review of the Minister's decision by anyone who was concerned about the Minister's decision, which is a pretty high bar. Move on, thanks. So for each of these proposals, just noting some preliminary sort of implications as we see them. The implication here is that Council could accept or reject the recommendations of an independent hearings panel. So as I mentioned, our normal process would be sort of handed over to our independent commissioners who would make a council decision on a change to the unitary plan. So in this case, the implication is that it would have to come back to the council at that point. That's the first implication. The second one is that this intensification plan change that we're required to notify next August would come into effect earlier than normal, and that's essentially by removing the ability of submitters to appeal the independent commissioner decision to the Environment Court. So that is likely to considerably speed up the process for this rezoning intensification plan change coming into full force. And the last one is really the key one here, that the way the bill is drafted, the Minister has a power that is considerable in cases where the Council has rejected a recommendation from an independent hearing panel. And just to note that there are some other aspects of the bill where Minister for the Environment is given powers that wouldn't normally exist in relation to planning issues such as this under the RMA. So that's the first key proposal. The second of the four is really probably the crunchiest and the meatiest. We've got I've got quite a few slides here. I think it's really important to just take a bit of time on this proposal here, because this is the key, most significant of the four as we see it, and that's with input from Auckland Transport, Watercare, and others. And this is the medium density residential standards. So the proposal is that these standards would have to be incorporated into the unitary plan next August. They would allow most residential landowners in Auckland to build up to 3 stories as of right, and to build 3 dwellings without the need for a resource consent. Importantly, 4 or more dwellings, so larger sort of medium density 3-story residential developments, could be applied for, and they cannot be notified by the council unless there is an infringement of some of the standards. There would be a non-notified resource consent. If someone was looking to breach some of these medium density residential standards in urban Auckland, then that potentially could be notified to people affected by it, typically an adjacent neighbour, but the Act or the bill is prescribing that, again, those infringements cannot be publicly notified for wider input. Move on, please. So, before getting to the implications of the medium density residential standards, just to sort of expand on things a bit, as I mentioned, the standards would kick in immediately. So normally when a council notifies a plan change, even a substantial one that we're going to be doing next August, until it's got its way through being tested through submissions and evidence and hearings and so on, the rules themselves don't have any legal standing. But in this case, the medium density residential standards under the bill would kick in immediately from next August. Key exemptions to note are that qualifying matters that we've discussed with the committee in several workshops and in agenda reports as well this year in the last few months still apply and are not affected by the bill. The bill, the council has proposed. If the council proposes more permissive heights or other more relaxed standards on the intensity of development that could occur in a part of Auckland, then those more permissive controls wouldn't kick in straight away in August. They would have to go through a process of submissions, hearings, and decision making. And there is an exemption in the bill for areas that are zoned large lot, which is a zone that we do have in the Auckland Unitary Plan typically around the fringes of the urban area, in places like parts of Titirangi and Long Bay are examples that spring to mind, where we have some large lot residential, recognising things like topography, vegetation, streams and so on in those sort of urban parts of the urban fringe, if you like. So just a little bit more on qualifying matters. Just to be clear, the government hasn't proposed any changes to the what's already in the National Policy Statement. We've had some clear direction from the Committee on Qualifying Matters. The NPS Urban Development lists some things of national significance that would be a reason to have a lower height than the 3 stories, for example, under the medium density residential standards. As you may recall, in the walkable catchments of the city centre, the train stations and so on, the NPS Urban Development requires a 6 stories to be enabled, 6 or more stories to be enabled in the unitary plan. That's not changing, and the qualifying matters that might justify lower heights than
I've lost John. Has anybody else lost John?
Yep. It's we'll just wait
see if he can reconnect.
Sorry, can I just...
John, we just lost you for about 20 seconds. If there was something you covered then, can you repeat, please?
Or just the slide again. The qualifying matters are unaffected, and that means that there could well be reasons, and there will be reasons, why enabling the 3 stories isn't appropriate in some locations. For example, matters of national significance, the relationship of Maori to ancestral lands and taonga is recognised and has been, I think, since 1991 in the RMA, quite rightly. So if 3 stories or 6 stories within a walkable catchment is compromising that relationship, that will be a reason to have a lower height limit. Special character areas, I heard there was a discussion previously at the local board input around special character. Council has a preliminary position on special character, and that is to look to retain areas of high quality, which requires a property by property street survey. That work is well underway. It's been impacted by COVID, of course, with the lockdown, but we're advancing that work with an approach endorsed by the committee at this point for special character areas. But I do note that the character areas will have to be reduced to some extent to meet the overarching intent of the NPS urban development. So we do have an approach on that, and the bill is not changing that approach in any substantial way. Council does have to produce evidence justifying these qualifying matters, and exemptions don't necessarily mean that no change would occur to the unitary plan at all. It just means that there might be a reason why 6 stories becomes 3 stories, or 3 might become 2 in a particular area. So moving on to what the medium density residential standards might look like, and I really just have to take my hat up and off in this public forum to our urban design team, who have in the last day or two just pulled this one off to give you a preliminary analysis and visual of what the medium density standards might look like. And what they've done here, apologies that's cropped off at the top, is that we've looked at the mixed housing urban zone. So that's the 3-story residential zone that was introduced through the unitary plan between 2013 and 2016. That's the 3-story residential zone that applies in parts of Auckland that are generally pretty well served by public transport or access to town centres and a range of goods and services and so on. So on the left-hand side of the column, we've got some of these sort of planning standards that apply in the unitary plan and in the medium density residential standards. In the middle, we've got the medium density standards that are in the bill. And on the right-hand side, we've got mixed housing urban in the unitary plan. So probably far too much detail here. The key things to pull out really is that the height control is roughly the same, 11 metres. That allows you to achieve 3 stories. Height in relation to boundary is the control that deals with how the sort of second and third story, how close they can be to the side and rear boundaries. And there is a considerably more generous, relaxed height to boundary control in the medium density residential standards. Setback from the front boundary, that's the front yard, is the same. The side and rear boundary setbacks at ground level are the same. Building coverage under the medium density standards is 5% greater than mixed housing urban. Overall impervious area, that's the combination of buildings and driveways, footpaths and so on, is the same at 60%. Outdoor living space, so this is an area for an outdoor court or a small garden, is 20 square metres in the unitary plan with some other dimensions of 3 metres. It's 15 square metres, so it's smaller by 5 square metres. Outlook space is a key control to just ensure that living rooms and some have at least a degree of separation between the window and an adjacent building on the same site or a neighbouring site. 6 metres in the unitary plan by 4 metres. Off living rooms, 3 by 3 is the dimension in the medium density standards. So in summary, the standards are considerably more relaxed in some areas than the mixed housing urban. So what does this look like visually? There's a methodology that the urban design team used. They took a moderate to large suburban site. If you averaged all sites, I think across all residential areas in Auckland, you probably land at about 965. But that's accounting for some pretty large residential zone sites, probably including some of the school sites as well, which takes that up to 965. But anyway, there are sites of 965,000 square metres out there that are developed quite extensively at the moment under the unitary plan. So they've taken that as a base. They've looked at what the maximum bulk you could achieve under the unitary plan mixed housings urban and under the medium density residential standards. There's been a factoring in of the NPS urban development requirement to remove the ability of councils to require any car parking as part of a development. That has to happen next Friday without any submissions, as you're well aware. And the focus here is very much on bulk and location. It's not about the architectural design or appearance. Thanks. So in plan view and cross-section view, so two-dimensional views, on the left-hand side, we go right to the sort of low-density single house zone that applies in some parts of urban Auckland. So that's the sort of footprint that you would achieve, with the green being areas of open space or potentially paving and driveways. It shows a ground floor, the single story and the second story, because of the angles, what we call height in relation to boundary. Even in the single house zone, there is the second story would have to be stepped in from that first story. If we move to mixed housing suburban, that's our two-story medium density residential zone in Auckland. 40% overall building coverage, that's what it looks like. Mixed housing urban, this is the key comparison here now, is 45% under the unitary plan of the site can be covered in buildings. You can see there with a height in relation to boundary control, certainly the third story has to be on a site of these dimensions, very much in the centre of the site as opposed to immediately adjacent to boundaries. With the medium density residential standards, the building coverage is up at 50%, and the building can certainly come, the three stories can certainly come much closer to the boundary. So if we could move on, please. Just looking at it in cross-section again, maybe just jumping to the two on the right, you've got the comparison between mixed housing urban built form. Heights are the same, but given the other controls in cross-section, medium density is a fair bit more bulk on the site and quite a bit more intensity and impacts on adjacent sites. Some analysis here of mixed housing urban compared to mixed housing medium density residential, starting to get a bit more real world in terms of putting in a development with car parking at the top. That's had an impact on how much of the site could be developed with buildings. The developer may make that choice to actually have fewer dwellings and have some off-street parking. That's the plan view there, with the green being courtyards, landscaping, the grey being areas for cars to circulate, pedestrians as well, and the sort of mid-colour being the buildings themselves. So that's a 6-unit development at the top. On the same site, that's at 900 or so square metre site, with the dimensions shown before, you're getting up to 9 dwellings under the mixed housing urban, just under the 45% coverage that's allowed in the unitary plan. It's a significant increase in yield, housing numbers, by removing the car parking. And then if we move to the medium density residential standards, yes, with that additional bulk, you could quite easily see another dwelling in there, getting up to 10 dwellings under the medium density residential with no car parking. So if we just look at these in a bit more detail, three-dimensionally, so the one on the left, well, perhaps start with the one on the right, because that's the status quo under the unitary plan at the moment. You might see development of that nature, possibly if they remove some of the parking or look to accommodate another dwelling or two. I'm sure under the current unitary plan you could achieve that. A unitary plan does require a small amount of car parking for mixed housing urban. With the parking removed as of next February, that's the sort of increase in yield that you might see mixed housing urban, and then we move to the medium density residential standards, and that's the type that would be possible. Again, this is just initial indicative analysis. We've had very little time to prepare this, and we need to do a bit more work on this to inform the submission. So if we can move on. This is looking at the issue of outdoor space and outlook. So mixed housing urban, that's the sort of minimum dimensions for an outdoor living court with that 6 metre distance from a living room window to ensure that there is reasonable quality of the indoor and outdoor living spaces. Under the medium density residential standards, that's reduction in the outdoor living courts and the reduction in the outlook, enabling a larger, bulkier buildings and with a smaller outlook in outdoor living space areas. In cross-section, looking at what that means for that outlook requirements. So on the left, we've got sort of the unitary plan. That's about as close as you could put two buildings to one another on a site or to a neighbouring site, with those 6 metre outlooks in the principal living rooms and principal bedrooms if they're facing one another. And then on the right hand side you see how much closer you could have living rooms and bedrooms under the adjacent to one another under the medium density standards. Just another example of the comparison there with the outlook. Sorry, the previous one was the outdoor living courts, and this one is looking at the outlook under a slightly different scenario. But again, you can see how much closer you could achieve developments either on a site or next to a neighbour under the standards. Move on, thanks. So just having a look at that from a street view, that's the sort of unitary plan, fairly full build out without any car parking provided. So that's the sort of density intensity that you would start to see under mixed housing urban, and we are starting to see in many parts of Auckland, but again, parts of Auckland concentrated around good transport and access to jobs, goods and services. If we look at the next slide, the medium density residential standards, that's the bulk and form that would be possible at a maximum build out, and we know that developers in some places do go for that maximum build out. In some cases they seek consent to go beyond the maximums, and we've had a workshop on that issue recently. So I just want to reiterate that they are fairly preliminary three-dimensional sketches, but they're intended just to give a sense of the difference between the unitary plan mixed housing urban and the proposed standards. So implications at a strategic level, so sort of getting back to away from the design issue perhaps at this stage. So enabling 3-storey medium density across urban Auckland and in some rural coastal settlements is what the bill would mandate. It enables a form of urban development, so a sort of city form in Auckland and the other Tier 1 cities that in our preliminary view is really contrary to achieving quality compact city. It's certainly contrary to the Auckland plan, that's both the 2012 Auckland plan and the more recent Auckland plan, as certainly contrary to the Auckland unitary plan. And the key reason is that the focus of medium and high density housing is in areas with good access to public transport, goods and services, whereas the bill would enable 3-storey medium density in areas that simply don't have that access to transport, goods and services. Now, or likely in the future. It's likely to result in higher carbon emissions than the Auckland plan and the Auckland Entry Plan approach to urban form. It's going to make it more difficult to effectively and efficiently plan, fund and deliver transport, water and community infrastructure. It will result in people living in medium density housing areas and areas that have never had or may never have good access to public transport goods and services. Sorry, repeating myself there, I jumped ahead. And in terms of the design issue that we just worked through there, we do feel at this stage, subject to further analysis, but it does appear that we're going to have poor on-site amenity and significant impacts on adjacent properties that can be mitigated in other ways. So the third of four proposals is dealing with intensification outside the immediate walkable areas of the city centre in Auckland, the 10 metropolitan centres and the rapid transit network. We've workshopped this quite extensively already. There was quite a lot of complexity, or there is quite a lot of complexity in terms of ideas of relative accessibility to transport and demand for housing. We now have a simpler approach proposed that simply talks about levels of height and density being greater around local town and neighbourhood centres. So there's definitely simplification there, which is a positive, we believe. And in terms of private plan changes, so landowners, developers between now and next August would be required to implement many more aspects of the NPS urban development than they currently do. And I guess that starts to bring into play private plan changes looking at things like height and density and walkable catchments, qualifying matters such as heritage or special character through a private plan change process. So potentially a preliminary view is that might start to preempt some council decision making on a more region-wide basis for next August. Next slide, please. So the last of the four proposals, financial contributions, a clarification that they can be applied to development that doesn't need a consent under the unitary plan or a district plan elsewhere in the country. The council currently charges development contributions under the Local Government Act. That is the council's preference, not financial contributions. It's a change that's likely to be of no or little benefit to Auckland. It may be in the future council uses a mix of development contributions and financial contributions, so there probably isn't a downside to it, but it certainly doesn't address the strategic implications of trying to provide infrastructure widespread across the urban area to support the level of density under the medium density standards. So I believe this is my last slide. Next steps, the bill was introduced to the House week before last. It had its first reading last week. There is a very tight time frame for something of this scale and significance to make submissions. So we're moving as fast as we can to support the committee in putting in a good submission. We've communicated with all local boards and getting great support from local board services colleagues to get an opportunity for local boards in this tight time frame to provide their views, incorporate their views in the council submission, and if received in time, and if the committee agrees to the recommendation of the report today, the delegated committee members will be able to have the benefit of seeing those local views before the submission is lodged. So we're aiming to circulate the draft submission next Thursday for comment from all committee members. They would unfortunately have to be received in a very quick turnaround for us to be able to present them to the recommended delegated group of committee members who would have the authority to sign off the submission the following Tuesday. And the government is looking to have the bill receive royal assent prior to Christmas. And again, this is all primarily about this intensification plan change that we are already required to do by next August and put up for submissions. So thank you, Chair, members of the committee. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, John. That's a very thorough run through, considering the constraints that we have. Just clarification, John, the maximum height as a permitted activity in the MDRS is 12 metres, including roof form, not 11. Am I correct in that regard?
Oh, apologies, Chair, that you may be correct. I just don't have that information to hand. We will just try and clarify that as soon as we can. Yeah.
I noticed you had an asterisk on it, which may have referred to that discretion to go to 12 from 11. So I think you'll find it 12. But look, members, I will move the recommendations before us, and that's A to E, and the Mayor will second. Thank you, Mayor. Now, there were some questions, John, that I did lodge earlier. Now, there were a number of questions there, John, so I want to make sure that other members get the opportunity to pose their questions as well. Do you have those before you, John? And maybe just as quickly as you can respond to those questions. Do you have them before you?
Thanks, Chair. I can. Yeah, I can see the questions. I'll just have to get to the first one. And
the first one, while you're waiting, was Government and National state the bill is good for climate. I've listened to the speeches in the House and I've read the Hansard, and I've also read comment afterwards as well, and they talk about the climate benefits. I can't see a climate impact statement supporting the bill. There is a regulatory impact statement. So what's the evidence that government or the National Party are relying on to say it's good for climate?
Yeah, I understand you're correct. There isn't a separate climate impact statement. We haven't seen one. It's there's a brief discussion around climate in the cost benefit analysis and the regulatory impact statement, but it's by no means comprehensive. So we certainly haven't seen any evidence that would support that at this stage.
Nothing there. Okay, look, the other questions relate to the bill focuses very much on quantity. There's no mention of anything other than yield. There's nothing in terms of quality. And I understand we can't put in design standards that make it less permissive. You might want to cover that. So how do we strengthen design standards? We've recently had a workshop, and every councillor, I think, it was expressing concern about what we were seeing from some of the studies that your team have undertaken, some 130 case studies of the Auckland Unitary Plan built outcomes. And following on from that, I've also noted in speeches and media statements from the Minister of Housing and National's housing spokesperson, they say that quality is going to be addressed through, and they use this interchangeably, through their Building Act or the Building Code. Now, how do either deliver good design quality outcomes that support the well-being of those that live in these new houses? Can you explain how the Building Act or Building Code might contribute to good design outcomes as opposed to, durable outcomes?
Thanks, Chair. Building Act and Building Code primarily focus on safety issues. It might be fire safety, structural safety, those sorts of things. There is a bit of thermal and acoustic design in there as well. So safety of buildings is a key focus. A bit on sustainability. I think Council has argued in the past and advocated for more on the sustainability front. But the sort of issues we're dealing with here are traditionally left to the Resource Management Act. Planning issues around overshadowing, privacy issues, the sort of quality of the indoor and outdoor living space, going beyond issues of just thermal quality, which is dealt with in the Building Act. So that they are different issues, and it's always been the case that these sorts of issues of design quality that deal with privacy, quality of outdoor living areas, indeed quality of indoor living space to a degree, with things like areas of outlook and so on, are addressed in planning documents and able to be so under the Resource Management Act. So we don't believe that the building code does adequately deal with all issues of design and the quality of the built environment. It goes well beyond what the Building Act or the building code are designed to achieve. Now, apologies, I'm looking at the chat in the Skype conversation, but I'm not really picking up the questions there. So
I will, that's fine. I will come to the question. There are some questions raised. So the question of quality and design is not addressed in the building code or the Building Act. It comes to the planning documents, and we are not allowed to be less permissive than the bill states. So we can't address the very things that were highlighted to us in the workshop you conducted with us recently. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's correct. The Building Act and Building Code have a different focus, and it is primarily around safety, thermal comfort and efficiency with things like insulation requirements and so on, fire safety requirements for housing, structural safety. Anyone who's applied for a building consent will know the sorts of things that are looked at, but they don't focus on the matters that were illustrated in the presentation here and the matters that the Resource Management Act and the Unitary Plan address.
Look, I get that. And what I'm leading to is that we can't introduce standards, design standards, that make the medium density residential zone as proposed less permissive. So we can't attempt to achieve better quality outcomes over and above the standards that have been prescribed. That's the key thing for me.
That's correct. The bill is very clear in preventing councils from adapting these standards to improve them in the sense of adding standards or tightening up the standards that are proposed.
Okay, look, thank you. I'll go to, I'll pause on the balance of my pre-lodged questions, and I'll go to members. And I think it was Councillor Simpson first. Councillor Simpson, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Look, my question that I foreshadowed during the local board input is that post the resolutions from the local board, their presentation today actually gives the evidence associated with their reasoning. And my question is that possible through you and the seconder and the mayor to amend D accordingly, or do I need to put up a resolution of my own to request that their presentation from today be amended, be attached as would their other local board resolutions?
Right, Chief of Strategy, can I go to you? We normally append formal positions of boards. I'm mindful of the very short lead-in time and lack of opportunity for boards to maybe formally convene meetings to confirm their positions. How should we approach this, Chief of Strategy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And there was a little bit of a discussion on this while you were moving rooms. So just to confirm that's right. We have agreed for years now that we would append formal resolutions of boards, and so that's absolutely what we'll do. And I know that the Ōrākei local board is one that has done that, and so that's fine. In terms of, let me call them informal feedback, in the sense that they're not formally resolved on, it has not been the case that committees append those. But what I've said, and will confirm again, is that as staff we have it, it's absolutely part of our consideration. And I think there is some evidence as part, that we've seen today that will be really helpful to include in our submission, particularly perhaps as an example for Ōrākei, or it could be in relation to the whole region, just depending on the issue. So I certainly undertake to include it clearly as part of our consideration, but our normal process here is not to append it, but consider it, and we'll certainly append the formal resolutions. Hope that's helpful. Thanks.
I suppose.
Councillor Simpson.
Yeah, I suppose, Chair, the point I'm making is the evidence that they have references the formal advice from our officers already presented to our planning committee. So I suppose in that end, I will have to wait and see what you come up with, which leads me to my next question is, what if I don't like what your delegation finally outlines?
I'll go back to the Chief of Strategy on that one. I'll dodge that one. Thanks, Councillor Simpson.
Nice work, Mr. Chair. Look, I think there's no difference on this one than anything where we've had, and it's purely because of timelines, as I know you'll understand, that we need a subgroup. What we're proposing is that we will pre-circulate it to the full planning committee, but there have been times in the past where not all members will agree with the direction or some or all of a direction of a submission. But that is the point of having a delegated committee, and you will just have to accept the decision that they will make in terms of that submission.
Thank you.
But Councillor Simpson, it will definitely be circulated. There'll be a very quick turnaround period. It's identified as just a very brief 24 hours, but we will be reading your feedback and that of others and giving it the absolute due consideration it deserves.
Thanks. I hope PACE committee on November the 11th isn't too long.
Good. Now, I think the next question was from Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my first question is to you. And I perhaps foreshadowed it with the presentation that we had from the Ōriki Local Board, but I can think of no issue in my years in politics that would impact more on our local communities and therefore local boards than this legislation. And would you entertain in the delegations to having a representative from local boards? So you've got yourself at the moment, the Mayor, the Deputy Chair and a member of the IMSB. I would like to see someone there representing local boards. Would you give consideration to that in your recommendation?
Always open to giving something consideration, Councillor Fletcher. I might just go to the Chief of Strategy here too, because I'm not clear on whether the local boards could actually find somebody to represent all the boards. So their charge would be to represent all the boards, in some ways representing Auckland, and that really is our job, to have that Auckland-wide lens. Our teams are working really hard to link up with boards, provide them with this information and get feedback. I'm confident that we will very, very well articulate the views of local boards in this submission. I have no doubt that we will. But Chief of Strategy, if that was a possibility, can you just outline
Mr.
what
Chair,
that would entail?
I'm happy to go into my questions while, if you want to give some consideration to that. But I'll go into my formal questions if
Okay.
that's of any. And may I firstly thank, because I recognise the turnaround time on this, I want to thank John Duguid and the officers for their response to what are some highly questionable assumptions that have been made with this legislation. So my first question is, has there, given the implications that we're hearing of poor on-site amenity and the significant impact on adjacent properties, you know, the lack of light, shading issues, lack of privacy, is there any international evidence on the impact on mental health on that poor on-site amenity?
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher, and through the chair. Yes, I believe there is. It's a while since I've read anything like that myself, but certainly in the past I was aware of those sorts of studies, and I'm sure people in our planning and design teams have access to them, so we can look to provide you or other members with any sort of studies along those lines. And it's probably a useful So thank you for just drawing that to our attention. We could potentially have that referenced in the council submission if we do have some relevant international studies.
Thank you for that, John. It's my understanding that there's a lot of international evidence on the impact of poor design, and I'm trying to think of the word, uglification, if you like, and the impact that it has on people's mental health. And I think we would be remiss, this is on our watch, we would be remiss not to include that actually in our submissions that we're going to make. So anything that you could do to actually capture, the not just on opinion, but actually on evidence that's credible, that this will be a really retrograde step for quality of life in Auckland. Secondly, my question to you would be, John, you've talked of the disbenefits, but given the existing release of land, within the unitary plan, and looking at this, are there any benefits at all?
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. Through the chair, our chief economist and others on the team are sort of working their way through the cost-benefit analysis support of the bill, and I've only really skimmed it at this stage, but essentially the case seems to be being put forward that creating extra capacity for housing through changing the height controls and density rules throughout urban areas in Auckland and elsewhere will increase the supply of housing. I guess as we've presented to committee in the past, and in the report itself, there is there's capacity for almost 1 million new homes to be built under the unitary plan as it stands. There'll be a lot of debate around how feasible that is, but that's the very large starting point just in the residential areas. That doesn't include above ground residential in the big centres or in the city centre or in our mixed use areas. So it's at least 1 million, and then of that, the economists and the analysis is saying that it's roughly 650,000 homes could commercially feasibly be built right now. So adding this extra supply through the medium density residential to other areas that don't currently enable that sort of density is really like it's like a farmer placing additional fertilizer on crops when we've already sort of fertilized the crops, and it's potentially getting to the point where we're damaging the very thing that we're trying to sort of grow and successfully nurture. So but that is the case that's being put forward, that this additional supply will make housing more affordable, and the preliminary view of those looking at the cost-benefit analysis are seeing that the costs are underrepresented, and the conclusion reached really isn't supported by that analysis. There are many other aspects, as we know, to housing affordability, and lifting the lid further on capacity under the Auckland Unitary Plan is unlikely to make any real tangible difference, is the view that we're following.
So it is based on a number of assumptions that, I see it as tantamount to rape of Auckland, and it's just, I can't believe that a piece of legislation with the significance of this is going to be rushed in such a way. So whatever you can do, John, to assist those who are delegated with this task would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
I'm not hearing anything. Is the chair dropped off the line?
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, take the point of order while Councillor Darby.
I found that last remark to be really unacceptable as part of a debate on housing, and I'd like it to be withdrawn and an apology made to us.
I have no intention of withdrawing, and furthermore, I'd say it's gang rape because it's by both Labour and National, and I'm appalled.
I would like then that standard orders note those words I find offensive. If you could ask Kalinda what the appropriate standing order is. If the member is unwilling to withdraw and apologise, I'd like them noted in the minutes. I find them extremely offensive. And I think I would be backed by every woman that I know.
Kalinda, can you contribute, please?
Yes, can you hear me, Councillor Bartley and members?
Yes. Yes.
All right. So under points of order, a member can request for words to be recorded if the words are objected to. So I believe Councillor Darby is back on the line. Councillor Darby, we've had a point of order from Councillor Casey asking Councillor Fletcher to withdraw her comments about her description of what the government is trying to do under this bill. So, and she has refused. So she's Councillor Casey is now asking for the words to be recorded in the minutes.
Okay, thank you, and my apologies, members, for disconnecting and coming back on. It is just the way it is. And I apologise, Councillor Casey, and I did not hear your point of order originally. So the request was to withdraw some comments, and Councillor Fletcher stands by those comments.
Mr. Chairman,
point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Well, just with me, please. Thank you. I'm addressing the point of order. Now, Councillor, can I just go to you again, please, Councillor Casey? What is your request? You've asked for a withdrawal.
I asked for a withdrawal of the initial remarks about rape, and I'm now asking for the withdrawal and apology for the second remark about gang rape. It is totally offensive.
I tend to agree with you in this age and what we know of both. Yes, Councillor Fletcher, would you consider...
I will withdraw those words and replace them with the non-consensual molestation of Auckland.
No. Just, Councillor Fletcher, it's not an opportunity to replace. It's just withdraw. Can you just please withdraw those words?
I will withdraw with reluctance those words, and if I could...
Thank you for withdrawing. Thank you.
I'd like an apology as well, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not willing to apologise.
No,
I feel very strongly about this.
Members, the member has withdrawn, and I would like to leave it there and move on with the business. Councillor Casey. I will take the next question, and I think it is from the Mayor. Mayor Goth, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My questions are really around how we design our submission, given the Labour national axis means that we're not likely to defeat the legislation. So the question is whether we can improve it. My first question addressed, I think, to John. One of the key worries we have, obviously, is poor design, aesthetics, sausage flat developments, etc. And you've answered the chair by saying that we have no way of making that legislation more under that legislation, making a more stringent controls on poor design. So the real question is, what would be the nature of protections that we might be able to build into the legislation to guard against poor aesthetics, poor neighbourhood form, poor living conditions? How do you have ideas about how we might amend that legislation through our submissions? Is that what your staff are working on?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Phil. Through the chair, I probably two aspects to it. There's the design issue, but maybe if I can address the more strategic issue around the degree of intensification and its widespread nature out to the edge of the urban area. perhaps an amended bill that does require councils to incorporate some sort of medium density standards, but perhaps for the 3 stories, a more targeted approach around areas that do have that improved accessibility to transport, jobs, goods and services. So, I mean, if you look at any other city that I'm aware of that plans for the future, you will see that difference in density as you get further away from those sort of amenities. So I think perhaps in terms of the council submission, an approach of, and noting your comments about the strong support in the House for this bill, there are certainly aspects of the bill that we think have merit, absolutely. The streamlining to some extent of the process may have some merit. The density around town centres, we think that's got a lot of merit. And maybe in terms of the medium density residential, the 3 stories should be a bit more nuanced and targeted. So that's the strategic issue. In terms of design itself, even if the provisions were replicating the mixed housing urban zone that we have in Auckland, that went through an extensive submissions process with numerous architects, urban designers, planners and other experts putting their views into an independent panel, those standards would certainly be better than the proposed standards. And it is a bill, of course, it's open for submissions, and hopefully the government officials and the government itself will look favourably on a submission of that nature to improve the standards and maybe have them a bit more aligned to mixed housing urban.
Okay, thank you. The reason I'm asking the questions in this way, because it then gives other councillors a chance to be involved in the early stage of the design of the submission. So your 2 that I agree that probably maybe, unless we can improve on it, requiring that we replace those provisions with our own mixed housing urban provisions. I certainly agree with the second one, limiting the geographic application, and I think we can make a strong case for that. My next question is about the streamlined planning process, and it's in 2 parts really. Is there any precedent that anyone can think of where the minister has the final decision making in planning as against a transparent judicial process like the Environment Court? And the second part of the question is, look, it may be that the current provisions in the RMA could slow down the process of intensification in an excessive way, but are you thinking about a middle course that we could push the government towards, that acknowledges the right of people to have their voice heard, but streamlines the process in a way that it's less time consuming? Because I think it's no good just opposing something. We'd need to put up a constructive alternative that met some real concerns that I think will be expressed by our community, but at the same time maybe streamlines the time taken in the process. Are you thinking of anything along those lines?
Thank you, Mayor Phil. So just to the first question around the powers that the Minister would have if this bill was enacted. It is very unusual. Since 1991, so that's 30 years now, we've had the Resource Management Act. The government, I think through the Minister, has had the ability to call in certain matters, be it a resource consent or a plan change. Rarely used, but typically that requires the establishment of a board of inquiry. So there is a sort of a process established there to then give the Minister advice. So there is a mechanism there, rarely used, and certainly not used on anything like this in terms of a widespread urban issue that I'm aware of. Minister of Conservation does have the final sign-off on coastal plans under the Resource Management Act, but again, that tends to be more of a formality rather than a sort of going against the council decision or in support of the council decision without any challenge. But so that's the first point. It's fairly unusual, or very unusual. To the second point, the middle ground that we're thinking is that no process works equally for everyone, but principles of public participation, the right to be heard, natural justice, those sort of things were generally embodied in the preparation of the unitary plan. It went through a process of a independent hearings panel. The recommendations went back to the council in much the same way as this bill proposes. But the key difference is at that point, if the council rejected something from an independent panel, the matter was able to be heard again. All parties could have the say before an environment court panel, which has commissioners, not just a judge. Whereas under this proposal, it doesn't go to the environment court for a rehearing. It's simply a minister's decision on what could be some fairly big issues. So the middle ground might be something like the unitary plan, where a panel does recommend back to the council some changes, and if the council rejects them, then all parties who've been involved in that issue can have a say in the environment court in the normal way. That would streamline the process. It would reduce the number of appeals, but it would enable some more contestable process rather than simply leaving it to the minister to make a ruling.
Thank you. My third question, if I may, Mr. Chair, through you. It seems to me that one of our critical arguments is that the cost-benefit analysis of taking away people's rights is not met by an equivalent benefit if the real problem is lack of infrastructure and skyrocketing construction costs holding back building construction. So I presume as part of the submission, we will be putting forward evidence, as you've put in our paper, that this bill doesn't actually hit the real target that it needs to be aiming at if the aim is to produce more and more affordable housing.
John.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor, through the chair. Given the time frame, I'm sure you and all members of the committee will appreciate we can't really produce much in the way of new, extensive, robust evidence or technical reports or so on, but we'll do our best to summarise our key views based on the knowledge and experience we have. But there are certainly existing studies, that some of which have been brought to the committee, have been published, produced by council and its advisors. So we can certainly rely on, because it's by no means a new topic, so we do have evidence that's been produced by council or other parties that we can cross-reference, rely on, and draw attention to government officials and the government in considering submissions on this bill. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think there's stuff in the public forum from Bell Gully and Kensington Swan that make those points that we can back our submission with. My last question is just to check out the degree to which you think the retention of qualifying matters addresses our particular concerns about special character. Does that provide any comfort that we can still protect our areas where we think that the heritage values are strongest and the special character values need to be protected?
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, as I mentioned, nothing seems to have changed in terms of the bill itself. The issue is really with the national policy statement itself, which doesn't give an automatic right for special character areas. It doesn't even list special character areas as being a reason to exempt an area from further intensification. So we still have to do the work. We still have to do the analysis and justification. As I mentioned, we do believe that there are some parts of the special character overlay in Auckland, that's the 20-odd thousand properties. We do believe that there will be some areas that simply don't pass muster, stack up relative to the thrust of the MPS urban development. These areas haven't been surveyed for many, many years, and there are certainly some streets and potentially larger areas that really wouldn't meet a threshold for retention. So I think we have to be clear that that's where it might be heading. But overall, there's a sort of no change in that situation. Under the NPSUD, there is a case that can be argued for retaining the older character protections in some parts of Auckland.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mayor Goth. Now go to Councillor Coombe. Councillor Coombe, you're cool.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Chair. Kia ora koutou. Thank you for the opportunity to ask questions on this. I do agree with what the Mayor said about that this is our opportunity to get the bill in a better shape. and I think we can do that without kind of resorting to offensive cliches and stereotypes, because there are some valid points that we need to make as we improve the bill. My question has been answered about the qualifying matters, because I think there might have been some confusion that those qualifying matters still continue, and particularly around that surveying work is still going ahead on the special character areas. So that work still continues regardless of the bill, right?
John.
Through the chair, that's correct.
Yeah.
Councillor Coombe, the work is continuing. The approach that we're taking is still in line with the Planning Committee resolutions, and that isn't directly affected by the bill in any way, shape or form.
And when we talk about, as of right, to be able to go up to 3 stories, 3 units, if you can't meet the building controls for that, you won't be able to go ahead. So it doesn't apply to every section, because presumably there must be a section size that just can't accommodate three buildings and 3 stories. Is that right? Once you apply all the building controls?
That's correct, Councillor Coombe, although with the generous height in relation to boundary control, the vast majority of properties would be able to accommodate the 3rd story, whereas under the mixed housing urban, many properties would, but in some cases there would have to be an amalgamation of 2 sites in order to achieve the 3-story development.
But do you have a sense of what would be kind of the minimum section size that could accommodate the 3 stories, 3 by 3?
Through the chair, it's probably more about the width of the site rather than the area of the site, and no, we haven't done that analysis yet, but a reasonably small site could comply with those standards. It may be only a very small footprint, but even quite a small site. There is an issue with the existing NPSUD in the walkable catchments where we may not even have the ability to have that sort of height to boundary control at all, because we have to enable 6 stories, but that's a separate topic that we'll bring back to the committee. It may be something we allude to in the submission, but getting back to the 3 stories, many and probably most sites would be able to comply and achieve a 3-story building.
Okay, I'd be interested to know if there is kind of a minimum section size. But my last question, Mr. Chair, is just in terms of the way that the submission is going to come together. B2 of the resolution seems to be a cover that we can pick up issues around, the issues around the quality of development, the design, the need for sort of design-led development, and also where it might not be suitable across Auckland to just have a one-size-fits-all. And so my question is, we've got the qualifying matters that can be worked through, but does this bill now going to put in place the ability to develop in places that were never envisaged? And you've got there, say, like some rural settlements. So will this part of the submission be picking up on the anomalies that don't fall into potentially the qualifying matters that we've got in the NPSUD, but should actually be removed from this the blanket requirements of the bill? So will there be like specific examples of where, we're within the Auckland boundary, because our boundary is so large, well, our region is so large, that there should be some more nuance to the bill rather than this just blanket, let's just apply it everywhere as if we're urban everywhere. Does that make sense, John, in terms of just, will we be able to pick that up, and will there be specific examples?
John.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Coombe. Absolutely. We have sort of got some real good experts poring over the bill, looking for those sorts of anomalies that perhaps were unintended, and that's the benefit of at least having a submission process. We can pick them up, draw them to the attention of the government officials and the government. Yeah, good point there. That there could be an argument that because the qualifying matters clause remains in the NPS urban development, council could use that to fix some of these anomalies. For example, the rural settlements issue is this 3-storey medium density residential, as we read it. We would have to permit that in places like Algies Bay, Snells Beach, parts of Patamahoe in the south. The small rural settlements, where they've got a wastewater system, they're essentially treated as urban and therefore subject to this intensification. We think that really doesn't make sense. Now, you could say a qualifying matter is that there's a constraint on wastewater, but then there's a whole exercise that we would have to do to, for every single property, produce a statement to say why that's important. We just think that's unintended, hopefully, and can be fixed through a submission. Yeah.
Thank you, and I do appreciate it's a massive piece of work, but I think we can work to allow for the benefits and opportunities of the bill, but to actually improve on it. So I just wanted to throw that in, Mr. Chair, because I don't need to comment further, but I'm happy to support the recommendation. Kia ora.
Kia ora. I'll go back to, because I missed this question, from Independent Māori Statutory Board member Karen Wilson. Karen, your question, please.
Kia ora. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, John, for the very comprehensive. We all understand there's timing is against stuff. My question relates to your acknowledgement that you've been unable to engage with mana whenua, given there are some qualifying matters that are specific for Māori mana whenua. Also, the equity issues, where the kōrero has been about wouldn't it be terrible to live like that, when in fact a large proportion of Māori do live like that, and may see that as not as repulsive as others may do, and has been described in very unfortunate terms by one of the councillors. So what is your intention, understanding all that, and to ensure that mana whenua or Māori do have a say, given the tight turnaround? What's your thinking? I see the recommendation subsection E doesn't add to what's acknowledged as no feedback, but no action around what you're going to do. Can you, if you understand my meaning, John, what's going to be done about that? That there's acknowledged nothing. So what do you intend to do?
With you again, John.
Thank you, Member Wilson. It is a real challenge for mana whenua right now to get involved in all of these processes, and the timeframes on this bill sort of make it really difficult to get any real sense of where mana whenua and Māori might sit on the bill. As you say, there may be some positives in terms of the bill, but initial engagement that we have had with a number of mana whenua representatives last week, certainly there are some concerns out there about the widespread nature of the intensification and potential cultural sites being put at further risk and so on. So in terms of a solution, it's really difficult. How can we get real meaningful engagement with mana whenua in a 3-week period that we're already well over a week into? We certainly recommending that we have a member of the Independent Māori Statutory Board to give a perspective, Māori perspective from the IMSB on the submission. But longer term, I think we've got till next August, or we have got till next August to produce the plan change. That's the key opportunity for involving mana whenua in Council's response to the NPS urban development rather than just the bill itself. That's where we have got a lot of things that we can work through jointly. I think we're flagging up in recommendation E that we have, or it may be in the report, I'm just looking at it now, we have had some feedback from mana whenua that they would like extensive engagement with Council on the NPSUD, putting the bill to the side between now and next August, and that is where we need to focus our efforts and see what that looks like, and ensure that mana whenua and Māori have a strong voice in the plan change for next August. But for the bill itself, I really don't have a solution there, unfortunately.
Just another query then, Mr. Chair. So there's an acknowledgement there, other than some comments that were expressed. Can you give us an understanding of comments you have received from mana whenua that gives you a sense that there's no support?
Back to you, John.
Thanks, Chair Member Wilson. Well, the primary one was this bill is potentially increasing the opportunity for development in areas that there may be and that there are culturally significant sites and values that with this level of intensification would be compromised. Obviously, Council has the ability to have qualifying matters, and that's a piece of work between now and next August to see what that might look like in the way of identifying further sites and values to protect. But that was the initial sense, that was density going into places and development going into areas that that presents that risk of cultural impacts. There were views that the quality of the housing would be poor for all Aucklanders, including Maori, coming out of the design standards. So that was a theme that came through from a few voices, but it's not a mandated kind of official view, if you like. It's just early corridor in relation to the wider NPSUD.
Thank you, John. And Mr. Chair, I'd like to say it's highly unusual that in something so significant that requires intensive input, that on this occasion there has been none. Highly unusual that it occurs. It doesn't appear to be any real solution other than we're all rushing to the finish line, and I'm not sure that that's a solution in itself. I did hear the kōrero around potentially a local board member being mooted for there by one of the councillors. I'm not mooting that at the moment. I'm illustrating that there's clearly insufficient time or resource being allocated for mana whenua or Māori to have a view.
Yes, and we take that challenge on board, and between now and over the next, 12 days, we will do our best in that area as well. It's a real tight time frame, and it's not of our making. I'm sorry, Councillor Wilson, Member Wilson, but we take your point. I will now go to, I've got a list here of Councillor Henderson, Bartley, Stewart, Dalton, Sayers and Walker. I will now go to Councillor Henderson with a question, please. Councillor Henderson. Have I got audio? No.
Yes, Chair, I can hear you.
Okay. Councillor Henderson, can you proceed?
He's having trouble, Chair. Can you go to the next one and he'll come back? Sorry.
Okay. Councillor Henderson's problem. It's not me. I will now go to Councillor Bartley, please.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question, but I'm not a robot and I can't carry on and act like that comment from Councillor Fletcher didn't happen. I think that's irresponsible. I have a lot of respect for you, Councillor Fletcher, but the use of words you use is insensitive, offensive. I'm deeply upset by those words being used in this context. So, yeah, that was just so wrong to do that. And I don't know how you can use it in terms of housing and development. And it's just wrong. Just wrong.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Bartley. The comments have been withdrawn, and I appreciate you coming in and reminding us that such language does not fit in our environment anywhere in council. And due to connection issues, I think I missed that comment at the time, and I should have pounced on it earlier, but I thank Councillor Casey, but the point of order has been made and it has been addressed. Thank you, Councillor Bartley. Councillor Bartley, did you have any other points to make or questions?
I did have a question.
Please proceed, Councillor.
My question is, I'm hearing a lot of opposition and a lot of issues around the bill and around what's presented before us. My question is, how are we actually going about with implementing the NPS, which is what we should be doing ASAP according to what the government has put in place. So aside from looking at what we can oppose, what can we actually implement and support?
I'll go back to you, John.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Bartley. So we've had really good discussions with the committee in workshops and in public meetings in the way of monthly planning committee reports where you as a committee have given staff really clear direction on how you see the NPSUD playing out in Auckland and really trying to make it work as best as we can for Auckland and provide the benefits that the NPSUD has the potential to provide. So by way of example, you've set a guide for where a walkable catchment should be from the city centre and from the 10 metro centres and from the RTN stations. So we're now looking at what levels of intensification we should, and additional opportunities for housing for Aucklanders and people coming to Auckland in the future in those great locations for public transport, jobs and access to goods and services. So that's well underway. It's a complex bit of work given the scale and complexity of Auckland and having to factor in the qualifying matters, but that's coming back to committee in the way of some very preliminary draft maps in February or March next year, involving local boards and mana whenua in that exercise. So that's the walkable catchments. You've given us clear direction around what to do with the special character areas. You haven't taken a position of retain at all costs the older protections in the older inner suburbs. You've given us a direction of staff to get on and do some really extensive survey work. The team have been really busy with that, making great progress. So there's a heap of work underway under your direction as a committee, and we will be bringing that back to you as soon as we can. We have been affected by COVID. That's all I can say on that front. There are definite benefits in the NPSUD. We acknowledge that, and we're working to try and make it work for Auckland. But that's pre this bill and the concerns that the bill does raise.
Thank you, John. Thanks, Councillor Bartley. I will now hopefully go to Councillor Henderson if he is reconnected. Councillor Henderson?
Hello, Chair. Can you hear me?
Well, you are with us from the West.
Fantastic. Thank goodness. Sorry, connection issues. So I've got a number of questions. I'm going to try and keep them brief. But drawing my colleagues' attention to paragraph 15 of this report, the climate impact statement, the whole point of the bill is to allow more housing in areas that are accessible to jobs, study and work. So how is this possibly going to result in higher carbon emissions rather than lower?
John, comes back to the climate impact statement, doesn't it?
Well, it does. There's no analysis, in-depth analysis or any real analysis of any substance to support that statement, unfortunately, but we'll continue to look for that and see where it might exist. But what the bill does is it puts, in our view, housing at a level of density into areas that don't have that access to jobs and public transport. So it doesn't achieve that across. It's gone too far into geographic areas that simply will be extremely difficult to ever service with decent public transport, and will be unlikely to have the community facilities and access to jobs that you get in the walkable catchments of the rapid transit network, the city centre and the metros.
Okay, I'll reserve my right to speak on that point, Chair, because I'm sure there'll be more to say about it. But I want to check. So I want to check with officers. Do they agree with the independent analysis done by PwC and Sense Partners in their cost-benefit analysis of this bill?
Back to you, John.
Thank you. Through the Chair, we've only had that report for just over a week. I'm not an economist. Our chief economist is looking at the report. But at this point in time, it'd be fair to say that we see some emissions oversights in the report, and some of the assumptions we are sort of looking into further. But in short, we think that it's potentially underestimated some of the costs associated with three-storey medium density across all parts of urban Auckland and the other tier ones.
Okay, I've got two more, Chair, just signalling that. So do officers agree with the finding in that report that the bill will, quote, result in more compact, efficient and socially equitable urban form? Do officers agree with that?
We're still working our way through the report, as I said, but our preliminary view would be that the bill does not achieve that aim.
Okay, my final question, and thanks, Chair. Look, I don't share many of the concerns that have been raised here by my colleagues. I actually support this bill, and I'll explain why in comments. But my question might be for Megan. How do I express this with my vote today? Because I don't want to give assent to a submission that has concerns that I feel are unfounded.
I'm happy to take that, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Megan, if you might, thanks.
Thanks, Councillor. Look, the purpose of today is obviously predominantly to get a delegation. We are still working up the submission, and so there is still opportunity for you to, whether it's today or between now and the close off of submissions, to provide us with your feedback. We are absolutely looking at the benefits of this, and there are some benefits, but also with the conversations that we've had with you as a committee over the last months with the NPSUD, there are also some concerns around it. So it will be a mixture of both, but there absolutely will be concerns, and a little bit like, I guess, the response to Councillor Simpson to, what if I don't agree with the position that is taken, or all of the position that's taken in the submission. I think that is no different to any other situation. So we'd be really keen to hear your perspective, Councillor. But I'm just, in terms of the lack of time that we've got here, we need to go through the normal process. And I'm not sure that I can give you any kind of further certainty beyond that, without saying that you have an opportunity to input. We will pre-circulate the submission, and we're really keen to hear from you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you, Megan. Thanks, Chair. Thanks, officers.
Thanks, Councillor Henderson. Just in the interim, Councillor Henderson, if you read the motions before us, I don't think there's anything that suggests, at this stage we're, for or against the bill. We're in the inquiry stage, though viewpoints are being expressed, including your own. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. I will now go to Councillor Stewart, please, with a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. And I want to thank John Dugood and Megan for all the work that you've been doing. I have to agree with Troy, some of his comments earlier on about the bill, that the intent is there about enabling supply, and we can already do this with the bill. But one of the things that I'm really concerned about is Howick and the special character areas such as Stockade Hill. It has been through the courts, and I think it's something that needs to be taken into some consideration. And I'd also like some consideration, Howick's another area that needs to be qualified. If you remember the 2004 report from Audit New Zealand, Montgomery Watson, there were a lot of parts of the Howick ward that was recommended that there be no infill housing, and a lot of that now is part of it. So all of this information needs to be taken into consideration. But one of the questions I'd like to also ask John Dugood, have you had any input from the Howick Local Board? Are all the local boards having input, or have you only found just a few?
John, back to you, please.
Thank you, Councillor Stewart. We haven't received any feedback other than the input from the Ōrākei Local Board at this stage, but we are aware that a number, if not all, of the local boards are putting in place a process to form up a view on the bill and provide that by the end of next week or by next Thursday. I think Wednesday, is the deadline, so that can be included in the council submission, or those views can be included. So nothing specifically from Howick that I'm aware of, but they have been briefed on the NPS urban development, and they have been briefed collectively with other boards on the bill, individually on the NPSUD, I believe.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. And will you be looking into what I've just asked you to look into about the Montgomery Watson Audit New Zealand report?
Thank you, Councillor Stewart. So I think that would relate to issues of flooding. Would that be correct? Flooding and flood hazards and so on?
And infrastructure, yeah.
Yeah. So arguably nothing changes there with the bill to a great extent. If there is a natural hazard reason, such as a flooding hazard, that is something that we could use as a qualifying matter to not enable additional intensification, but I can't guarantee that would be the case right across large parts of Howick by any means. It's an issue we'll have to look at. So it's probably more a matter for the NPS urban development as a whole, as opposed to the bill. But we will look into that in a bit more detail, Councillor Stewart, as we prepare the submission.
Thank you, Councillor Stewart. Thank you, John, for the reply. And I will now take the call of Councillor Sayers, please. Councillor Sayers, are you with us? I will go to Councillor Walker then, please. Councillor Walker?
Yes, hi. I'm online. I've got a few questions.
Please, yes.
You can hear me okay?
Yes, your question, please, Councillor Walker.
So I'm looking at one of the recommendations, which is B, and in particular B2. I think the particular concern that you're hearing from a number of people is that there are issues that go to affordability. I'd suggest we have a good case there. There are significant issues in sustainability. There are significant climate change implications. There are obviously issues around amenity. So this bill is flawed on many fronts of a significant order of magnitude. Is it possible to have some of those things added to B2? Because as it stands now, that in itself is quite limiting. Obviously, 3 is a bit more expansive in respect of relevant aspects of the bill. So I'll just raise my questions, Mr. Chair. So that's one question. The other question I've got goes to the impact on infrastructure and the absolute chaos, I would suggest, that this bill will release, particularly around issues that go to wastewater, water, stormwater, inundation, transport, and a related question to that, and that is, will we be giving specific examples? As a lead into that, Whaopraoa has got huge constraints around transport. Yes, Penlink may address part of that for a limited part of the peninsula, but if we have more intensification, it leads to absolute chaos and gridlock that even public transport is not capable of resolving. The other question I've got just goes to inundation. We already have development occurring in areas where it should not be happening. This just exacerbates everything still further. A related question that goes to all of this, and that is the necessity to actually fund a campaign to take out an advertisement in the Herald, maybe more than one full page, so that Aucklanders are aware of what is happening, and we take the government on more directly in a political sense. And the question is, what budget do we need to allocate to that if we are actually serious here? So some questions, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate that some of those may be difficult for Mr. Duguid to answer.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. Look, just in terms of the B2, the way it's written up, it doesn't grab every single point that might be raised in the final submission. It's embracing that. And if you look at B3, that's the cover, Councillor Walker. It is a real challenge to bring the teams together, but I can tell you, because I've been asking these questions on your behalf, who's involved, and it's everybody from water care to Auckland Transport, the chief economist, the finance team, the healthy waters team, plans and places, regulatory, and the list goes on. And John, Can you just give us a quick summary of who's involved here and just a quick snapshot of the issues that you're collecting together to be addressed, John?
Thank you, Chair, and to be part of Councillor Walker's question there. Yeah, we have assembled a team across the council, the council family, water care and AT staff and senior managers have already expressed major concerns with the bill in terms of some of the difficulties that this could present in terms of planning, funding and delivering infrastructure. It makes it very difficult to know exactly where that investment will be needed, and there is high risk of over-investing in some areas and under-investing in other areas, having to perhaps delay or stop certain projects in order to divert funds to a level of density that wasn't anticipated in an area that really isn't that suitable for that level of density. So working across Auckland Transport Water Care, we've had Panuku also involved, some concerns raised by Panuku as well in terms of what it might mean for some of their developments. And then across to Healthy Waters, the consents team who are at the coalface, the resource consents team, our strategy colleagues. It's really, everyone's really doing the best to understand the bill and provide the delegated members with best advice possible in the short time frame. So just building on that, Councillor Walker, your question around places like Whangaparoa and transport constraints, wastewater constraints, those are the sorts of things that, and back to Councillor Coombs' point, that really in some places we shouldn't be having to rely on a qualifying matter and all the analysis that goes along with that to justify an approach to zoning that may be more in line with the unitary plan at present than the medium density residential standards would be our view. But the other matters around amending the resolutions and campaign, I can't speak to those. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. Yeah, just Councillor Walker, if I can respond. Our teams are quite stretched in responding. I don't think there is a great advantage in the council. In fact, I don't think it's council's job. Our job is to do our very best and represent the people of Auckland through this submission. We're well connected to our local boards, and we need to improve our relationship and connection with mana whenua and inform this as fully as we can. We're run ragged on this, but we will do our very best. I don't think taking a full-page advertisement in one newspaper is going to make a great difference, to be honest.
Have we had any advice on that? Where is our leadership?
And we don't have any time to consider that right now, right today. I'm sorry. I'll go to other questions. Councillor Sayers, you're with us again, so I will pass back to you. You had connection issues, Councillor.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My apologies there. And look, John, fantastic job, good presentation. I really appreciate those diagrams that you put up too, with comparison to the unitary plan, which makes it look fine for delivery of numbers. But my question is a question really a bit around confirmation about in the rural area. You did touch on it earlier, mentioning water networks. So with these proposed medium standards, would those standards apply to the rural residential zonings in the regions, you know, like rural countryside living and rural and coastal settlements? And I heard you say that we might be reflecting some desired changes around the rural or coastal zones, John, in the submission. So just what form would that take? Like, in other words, what are those changes that you'd be putting in submission? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Sayers. John?
Thank you, Councillor Sayers. So, yes, as we've identified, it's in the recommendations on the screen here. At the moment, it does appear as though a number of Auckland's small rural settlements on the coast and inland in rural areas where you have a places like Alges Bay and Snow's Beach and so on. Certainly, if they've got wastewater treatment of some sort, we think they're well in the scope for this medium density residential as proposed in the bill, and we don't think that's appropriate at all. There are other small settlements that don't have reticulated wastewater systems, but still have a reasonable concentration of houses and maybe a few shops and so on. That they may potentially be within the scope of the bill as well. We'd have to check that. But the general rural areas, you're sort of more countryside living through to extensive farmland and parts of the Hunuas and Waitakere ranges and so on, well and truly out of scope, not touched by this the bill. But it is those small concentrations of villages on the coast and inland that we have a concern that they are in the scope of the bill, and that should be in the submission to effectively take them out of scope.
Okay, John, lovely. Thank you for that answer. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Sayers. One final one from me, and it's a very quick one, John. The PricewaterhouseCoopers report, the way I've read it is it's not an analysis of options to a question that might be how does government go about increasing the supply of land to enable more housing more quickly in Auckland. It is a response to a political choice outlined in what is effectively a draft of the bill. I'm talking about the medium density provisions particularly. And there is a narrow scope within which PricewaterhouseCoopers is required to reply. Is that reasonably accurate, or am I stretching it, John?
Thank you, Chair. I'd really just go to your last summary statement there, that it's a narrow scope, and the initial advice that we're receiving from our economist is that the costs seem to have been underestimated, and the analysis doesn't necessarily address the question around housing affordability. But as I say, as I've said before, I do have to acknowledge I'm by no means an economist. I haven't really analysed the report to the best of my ability in detail, but I have, to the extent as I mentioned there, picked up on the fact that it seems a fairly narrow scope, and that we are giving advice that the costs are by no means covered, and it's the infrastructure costs and some of the social and environmental costs that have been discussed in this agenda item. But we will have some advice.
We've concluded the questions. We'll ask the staff and thank the staff for their work to date. John, all the teams involved. Members, it is gone past 1 o'clock, and as I signalled earlier, I think we should now break for lunch, and we'll come back and we will have members' comments on the motion and the report before us after lunch, and that will be at 1:30. So we will stand adjourned and come back at 1:30, and we will start with comments to complete this item. Thank you, members.
Councillor Cashmore.
No.
Councillor Collins.
Hey, Kalinda.
Councillor Coombe.
Present.
Councillor Cooper.
Here.
Councillor Dalton.
Present.
Councillor Philippina.
What a beautiful day, yes.
Councillor Fletcher. Mayor Goth. Councillor Henderson.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Councillor Mulholland.
Present.
Councillor Newman.
Good afternoon, Kalinda.
Councillor Sayers.
Yes, present, Kalinda. Thank you.
Councillor Simpson.
I'm here, thank you.
Councillor Stewart.
Here, thank you.
Chair Taipari. Councillor Walker.
Present, Kalinda.
Councillor Watson.
Good afternoon.
Member Wilson. And Councillor Young.
Good afternoon, thank you.
Present.
Thank you, members. And
sorry I missed a roll call, Kalinda. I was walking the dog.
Thank you, Councillor Casey. Welcome back all. We'll reconvene the meeting, and we have concluded questions on the item, which is item 8, the Enabling Housing Supply Bill before us. We have the motions before us. They're moved and seconded. The staff have stepped away from the table, the virtual table, and we are now into debate, members. First up, I think I had the Mayor. Mayor, if you were rejoining, just in the process of rejoining, I think. Mayor, if you are with us, could you signal and take your call?
Thank you. Just had some connection problems there. Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Look, it's important to understand the politics of what this legislation is about. Normally, I'd welcome bipartisan approaches across the floor of the House to try to address a problem. And we saw that with the congestion tax. We're seeing this, I think, probably for the wrong reasons. And there's a real tendency here from respective governments that haven't succeeded in solving the housing problem to blame it on local government. And you've seen the blowback against council. We're being blamed for red tape, etc. I think we need to address that in our submission. We need to acknowledge the problem that the legislation purports to address, the shortage and the unaffordability of housing. And we need to emphasise the Auckland Council's commitment to using the levers that are available to us. And, you know, we're currently getting 70% of our building consents are for intensive housing, apartments or terrace housing. We're currently consenting historically record levels of new building, 20,000 a year. So that kind of really raises questions about whether there isn't enough land to build on, because right now they are doing it, they are finding it. But what we need to emphasise is that we need to create housing of an acceptable quality and design and neighbourhoods that people want to live in. We don't want to create the slums of the future. And while we can point to their renders of intensive housing, you know, 3-storey, beautiful buildings, beautiful developments, they don't look anything like the nature of the housing that's being built by some cowboy developers right now, where we have too little control over design, and this is going to leave us with even less control. I think in terms of the medium density residential standards, we need to promote the need for strong design and quality and attractiveness of buildings. And we need to ensure that if this is about trying to reduce emissions, then why the hell are they allowing this sort of development in areas where there aren't good transport connections? And we need to ask, I think, for that area covered by this to be reduced. I reject some of the equity arguments. You know, I don't doubt that in Orake, Remuera and Ponsonby, the high-value sections will result in high-value housing. Where I see the real problems with housing design is in Takanini, Manurewa, Papakura, Mangere, where you'll get the fly-by-night developers building shit houses, excuse the French, because that's what they think they can make money on and they can get away with. The second thing we need to push for is agree that there needs to be streamlined planning, but also argue that there needs to be transparency around that, and that the public do have the right to be involved in making submissions, but what the government is doing is going too far. So, and finally, I think we should just emphasise that if the problem is insufficient housing and insufficient affordable housing, then the answer is, you know, provide the infrastructure and provide, deal with the housing supply chain problems that is holding up genuine construction. So it should try to be a constructive submission, but make our points really strongly. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mayor. Good points. Nice summary. Thank you for that. And now I just need to make sure I follow the list here. I have got comments now from Councillor Watson, please. Councillor Watson.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. And some good points there, Mr. Mayor, particularly as it goes to the politics of the situation. I was beginning to wonder if I was the only one drawing similarities between this announcement and that Aussie sitcom that pokes fun at governments and bureaucrats too, by the way, and elected officials who largely spend a lot of their time with big announcements that appear to be the progress without the substance of it. And I think that's, there's an element of truth in this, unfortunately. When I looked at that slide that John Duguid put up today in respect of the implications, and just to name a couple of those points, the of the medium density proposal be contrary to achieving a quality compact city, contrary to the Auckland plan and unitary plan, which focuses on medium and high density in areas with good access to public transport, likely to result in high carbon emissions, much more difficult to effectively and efficiently plan, fund and deliver transport, water, and so on and so forth. There's just a whole raft of potentially negative effects that just seem glaring. And I guess the one that really stands out, and it warrants being repeated, is this quite astonishing figure of 900,000 dwellings that are enabled by the unitary plan. I mean, if the Mayor's figure about 20,000 a year is right, that gets getting close to nearly half a century's supply in the Auckland region. So I don't know who the government people, whether National Labour, who on earth they're talking to. You would have to question how much driving around Auckland they're also doing, a little bit like the last administration. When you see the massive, and I mean massive, developments of all types of intensified topologies that are occurring east, west, north or south in Auckland, just on an unprecedented scale. When I look at my own ward, places like Hobsonville, like Long Bay, Whanuapai, wherever I turn, you have this massive number of mixed housing urban, mixed housing suburban typologies getting rolled out, and with plenty of capacity nearby to continue this trend, and not having any effect on affordability, mind you, but in terms of supply and in terms of future supply, it just makes this proposal seem a little farcical. And we certainly had a bit of an experience in terms of unforeseen results up here in Whangaproa in the late 80s, where they had a program of cross-leasing, where it was very easy to cross-lease, divide up your property, even though there were big sections, and every man and his dog was running around cross-leasing their property, and they had to stop it after a couple of years because of the perverse effects in terms of quality of, I'm going to say urban design. That's a bit misleading. It was just little houses getting squeezed in wherever they could, no types of amenity, and then loading up all the infrastructure that the Rodney Council couldn't cope with. So I would see another repetition of that if this was allowed to proceed in the manner that's been proposed by the government. I guess if we're doing a submission, I think it would be nice if John Duguid's little analogy with the fertiliser was slipped in there somewhere, where we're really in a position of piling fertiliser on top of fertiliser, and everyone knows that when you do that, you actually end up killing the grass. And I think what we would end up doing is killing the quality of life in Auckland, such as it is, if that was rolled out on the almost indiscriminate manner that appears to be getting enabled here. Finally, Mr. Chair, and it goes back to the Mayor's very apt opening commentary about the unholy alliance that seems to emerge here. I have mentioned in the past this research work of Kay Saville-Smith that refers to the estimated government capital assistance to low-cost new builds over the period since 1960, and that's really the telling factor that it would appear this proposal is certainly not addressing, and indeed hasn't really been addressed at all in the last 6 decades in between, of the relatively low amount of capital assistance from government going into low-cost builds, which in the 60s made up over 30% of the construction that was occurring. So as much as we are honour bound to go through this process, I hope that we do make some suitably strong points. Certainly that slide that was put up by John Duguid would be a good start, because the result of this would be a poor one for no matter what part of Auckland you're living in. We'd end up with a whole lot of big barracks. We've got enough housing disasters that have been unfolded in the last 2-3 decades without repeating it through this process. So I hope our submission is strong. It does make the relevant points, and it fortifies the position of Auckland and Aucklanders, because what's becoming increasingly apparent during recent times is that the view of Auckland Council as such doesn't seem to be getting too much prominence. Now, whether that's getting caught up in the national mix, I don't know. But certainly I would agree with Councillor Walker. I think it's time for us perhaps to be a bit more assertive than we've been as a body. I'm sure there's individuals do that, but certainly as a body. Otherwise, we're going to end up with these perverse results that are being tabled here just a matter of years after we spent $35 million going through a lengthy and arduous process to come up with this kind of planning outcomes that we now have that actually does address the issue of supply and the other housing concerns that this apparently is, showcased to confront too. So I look forward to receiving, some prior notice of what we're planning to put there, but I hope it's strong. I hope it doesn't mince its words and it spells things out as they are. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Watson. I'll now go to Councillor Newman for comment, please.
Oh, well, thank you, Chair. Look, I mean, firstly, thank the officers for presenting on this matter. I mean, in many respects, Chair, I'd describe this bill as an exclamation mark that comes after the NPS on urban development. But just because the bill has wide political support doesn't mean it's a great piece of legislation. I think that the legislation is being championed by parliamentarians who have little or no working knowledge of planning and resource management. Secondly, Chair, it does highlight how drafting standards have changed over time. Chair, there's legislation that dates back decades, which was really, really well drafted, and it was unambiguous. The intent was clear. It wasn't contradictory and circular. And I compare that to some of the ambiguous bills that are being drafted these days, government bills that are being drafted. Chair, you are right. Expecting this bill to somehow talk to the Building Act around standards is nonsensical. Chair, I recall that supply roadblocks were supposed to be removed by the special housing areas, the great housing accord that turned out to be developers' lotto. Now Auckland is supposed to be one great big version of Simulation City. Well, I loved playing Sim City when I was young, but I am appalled to see the disruption, and I will describe it as the urban injury that occurs when people who have anticipated quiet enjoyment all their lives suddenly have prefabricated Soviet-style towers shadowing their backyard. Couple that, Chair, no car parking, moving from permeable to non-permeable surfaces, wastewater choke points, constraints on water supply, school zonings contracted. These are real-world problems, and we need to reflect that in our submission. We've got live-zoned parts of Auckland right now where there is no means to get water to the subdivision. We should say that in our submission. Chair, in conclusion, I don't want Auckland to donate our region's internal organs to Wellington simply to pass a bill. The Mayor is right about his concerns about housing typology in South Auckland. Heck, in the middle of a pandemic, we can't even get scaled up support for on-the-ground vaccination in the epicentre of where, COVID-19 is seated. So how are we supposed to rely on Wellington's policy scribes to defend urban form and standards. The good news, Mr. Chair, is that John Dogood is a very credible planning practitioner, and I have confidence based on what I have heard from Mr. Dogood, not only in relation to this, but also in the NPS discussions, that the officers are very well placed to articulate the problems and to identify the shortcomings in legislation. But the other thing that I think needs to be written into the submission, Chair, when it goes to the issue of affordability, Mario Fernandez's evidence is devastatingly powerful and irrefutable. And I think that the analysis that he brings needs to be absolutely fundamental to that submission, because I don't believe that the government for one moment is going to be concerned about the urban form of streets and neighbourhoods in Auckland. But I do think that Mr. Fernandez's evidence about the cost of housing supply, what you would expect the market to deliver, and its relationship to those first home buyers, that needs to be fundamental to our submission. It's irrefutable. And if that is fundamental to the submission, Chair, then I'm happy to support that. But I would ask that the officers ensure that that Mario's analysis is written right up front in that submission, and that he ought to be one of the officers that presents before the Select Committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I will now take the call of Councillor Cooper, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I'll probably be at risk of repeating a whole lot of very good things that have been said so far. But first of all, I do want to add my support to our planning staff. We've probably got some of the best planning staff in the country. And because I've also been through the brimstone and fire of our unitary plan process, and we were really, really brave then, and we pushed the envelope. And in the end, we worked with our community, we took them with us. And even though some of them weren't happy, at least they knew, look, there's urban design guidelines, there's heritage guidelines, there's all these things. This just rides roughshod over that, and it is really bad faith with our community. And it's a bit like the announcement with Three Waters. If we say we can't do the water infrastructure, they'll say, oh, well, that's why you need Three Waters. It's a circular argument again, and I'm really disappointed in that. And I think that, you know, we did the hard work. As we said, we've got 1 million dwelling capacity. That's the minimum of 2 million people. You know, that's just extraordinary. We've actually done this work when all the other councils haven't been this brave before. And just like Three Waters, this isn't fit for purpose for Auckland. And I think that's where Wellington really doesn't understand anything beyond the Rimatakas. And I think that's the whole problem with this. They just want to push it. And I think, you know, to be a bipartisan bill as well, you know, everybody's scrabbling to keep blaming councils, just as they always do. And I hope that one of my local MPs that's very keen on his street corner meetings to call out council on the current density developments that we're doing, that people are already struggling with, will be the one to front up if this goes through. And it will, because it's got full support. So I think we've absolutely got to be very strong, and I love the fertiliser analogy. And this is a government that wants no more fertiliser going to our streams, but they're willing to do that in our cities. Look, we haven't got the infrastructure capacity, and this is too fast. You know, this is just too fast for people. We're not taking them with us. We don't even get a chance to take them with us. And I think it's really bad faith. I absolutely have faith in our staff that they were brave before and they pushed the envelope. So if they are saying this is not good, I absolutely believe them. So I'll support whatever goes through. It's a shame we won't be able to make a difference with it. I don't think there'll be any changes, because every time we've tried to change anything, we haven't been listened to. And in fact, the fact that we had terms of reference that would be included in the development, any of this development, we were ignored. And so, you know, we'll be the people left carrying the can with this, dealing with our communities who are struggling.
because they're already struggling in some places with the density with the AUP, and with this added burden, it will cause, you know, untold harm in our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cooper. I will now take the call of Councillor Henderson, please.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I applaud this government for taking positive steps to address the housing crisis and enable an urban form that is best able to meet the challenges of climate change and local work. What's more, I'll remind everybody that this is bipartisan, which is both great and rare. I cannot agree with the contentions that it will increase carbon emissions, nor can I agree that the bill is contrary to a compact urban city at all. I haven't heard any evidence of this at all today, at all, and I have asked about it. Some of the concerns we have are about design-led developments, and I think that's the kind of constructive feedback that we should be picking up and we should be focusing our submission on, places where we can actually make an influence and make a change. The cost-benefit analysis independently produced by PwC and Sense Partners is gold. It clearly states that these changes are expected to deliver more homes where people need them and to slow house prices based on land price. Under the current regime, we have people wanting to build in far-flung places like Patamahoe on elite soils with no services, and we cannot say that our system is getting it right. Let's talk about homelessness in the housing continuum, because that's where things really, really bite. When families are priced out of home ownership, they have to rent. This bids up the price of rentals and it brings down the supply, meaning those at the bottom of the market struggle. Our homelessness goes up because supply constraints have meant they have no option. Homelessness impacts people's mental health a lot more than some of the other points raised today, like beautification of the house. I'm looking at the data here from November 2020, the earliest that I could find, and this clearly shows the first 7 local board areas with the most number of consents granted, and I've raised this before in a debate, but here they are. Henderson Massey number 1, Papakura, Howick, Hibiscus and Bays, Rodney, Upper Harbour and Franklin. We aren't missing out on intensification in the suburbs, I'll tell you that. Quite the opposite. Our city is piling housing into places with the worst access to jobs, the worst access to study, the worst access to public transport. Now, we in West Auckland are welcoming types. It's rare for me to meet anyone that doesn't see we have a housing problem, and many support the changing face of our communities. But when we look at places like Massey, which is nearly all mixed housing urban, and without any rapid transit network or even adequate buses, this is where we see that something is wrong with our planning here. And yet our rules lock people out of places in the Central Isthmus that have everything you need for a good, happy life. Accessible to everything you need. Again, we're welcoming types in suburban Auckland, but all we want is fairness across the city. That's all we want. This will take the pressure off suburban Auckland. A lot of it is struggling and straining at the seams. Now, lastly, I want to wrap up by talking about uglification. So this has been mentioned several times already today, and I'm sorry, colleagues, if I sound passionate about this, but, you know, people have been talking about uglification with relating to intensified housing. Now, I live in an intensified housing development with my family, 3-storey townhouse. Many of my community do likewise across West Auckland, and it's good enough for them. I find the word uglification embarrassing and borderline offensive. I'd invite people that think that our homes are ugly to come to my neighbourhood, where we all know our neighbours. Our kids grow up together. They play in public parks next door. I'll tell you, we're bloody proud of our homes. To wrap up, Chair, sorry for my passion on this, but I think there are areas where we can have good input and we can improve. I agree with the Mayor fully on this point. I look forward to reading a constructive submission where we're working with the government who has the best interests at heart. I won't be supporting it if it doesn't enable homes in the places people need them. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Henderson. I will now take the comments from Councillor Dalton, please.
Thank you, Chair. And look, I support the recommendations of the item as you have them there. But in terms of the bill itself, which I think might be more of a comma than an exclamation mark, because there's undoubtedly more to come for us, the issue for me is really the same as most other people's, and that is the unintended consequences of the bill. And I say that having sat in the October workshop and seeing the evidence of that were provided to us, the recommendations from the monitoring report into the RPS on the built environment section, And what we saw there, perhaps with some vindication from some of us, were the unintended consequences from residential provisions that manage the built form, the privacy, amenity and access to sunlight and daylight. This bill is going to exacerbate those outcomes for families, large families who need room inside and outside. People need to be able to go outside to get some space from the family inside. The bill itself, it talks around intending to enable multi-generational Māori and Pacifica families living on the same section, which I think is great. It's an ideology, and I mean that positively, but I don't know that it's likely to be affordable enough to be a reality for our families. And when I think of our families, I am thinking about the area that I live in and the area that I represent, because I can drive down many streets across Manurewa and Papakura, and I can see the unintended consequences that were realised in that monitoring report that we had presented to us in October. One of the intentions of this bill too is to reduce emissions by enabling intensification around the frequent traveller network. I think that development is likely to magnetise to the outer suburbs where the land is cheaper to intensify on brownfields. And this is where multimodal travel is really difficult. So I'm not sure, in the short term, how emissions will reduce, because it's going to need that increased investment in multimodal transport infrastructure. And that's certainly not planned to align with the implementation of the Act or the bill once enacted. And of course, we also need to contend with the removal of the minimum parking limits. We've got to factor that into the mix. So there's a lot of complexity and a lot of moving parts, and it's really hard to, I like to think I can visualize things, but this one is a bit of a struggle. And as John has said, we already have something that is working really well for us. I think that given the constraints that we now have in the building industry, this bill isn't going to help Tāmaki build houses any faster. The bill is not going to meet the needs of our larger families, and their quality of life and space to live will continue to be compromised. And I too really like John's analogy of putting more fertiliser on the land that has already been fertilised. We know that too much of a good thing usually results in an undesirable and unintended outcome. So I get the intention of the bill. We want to build houses. We want more and more houses. But boy, we've learnt a lot through the unitary plan journey so far. And I hope, more power to the officers drafting the submission on behalf of Tāmaki, and more power to the people that are going to have sign off on this on behalf of councillors after we've all had a good look at it. So that's really where I sit on this bill. Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity.
Thanks for your contribution, Councillor Dalton. Now we're going to Councillor Walker, and Councillor Walker is proposing an amendment. Councillor Walker, can you tell me, is your intention to put Aucklanders in a position to be able to be informed and to submit to the Select Committee? Is that your intention?
Yes.
So just on that, I just want to preface, before you move this motion, that will be near on impossible, because we will not receive our draft submission to be circulated amongst Planning Committee members until at the earliest Thursday the 11th, at the earliest. And then we've got maybe 24 hours, maybe the Friday, the Saturday, the staff will be working on it on the weekend, and then the close off for lodging submissions is the 16th, and there's almost no time. And the communities of Auckland, Councillor Walker, have got the same problem that we've got. We will not be in a position to be able to properly inform Aucklanders if we were to go out and inform Aucklanders.
Through you, Mr. Chair?
Yes, Councillor Walker.
I'm happy to speak to this amendment at the appropriate time. I'd appreciate it if you don't second guess it at this point. Shall I read the amendment?
Yes, please do, Councillor Walker. I'd like to hear it.
That Council allocate a modest budget to inform Aucklanders of the likely consequences of the Resource Management Amendment Bill, and that this be undertaken with some urgency, including advertising in the appropriate media. Moved, Walker. Seconded, Stewart. And I'm happy to speak to this at the appropriate time, Mr. Chair.
It's your speaking turn, so this is the time. And you have put the motion, you have a second.
All right. So speaking to the motion, Aucklanders have been ambushed, and so has this council. We know from the work that we have done to date that in terms of an evidence base, this bill has immense ramifications that affect Auckland Council financially and also Aucklanders. I would suggest that it is not going to lead to more affordable housing, but actually the reverse, that it will effectively reward development that is of the poorest quality and amenity rather than the best, and we see the track record of that already. And I agree with all of the other speakers like Angela Dalton and others that have pointed out that there are significant unintended consequences. Now, we may have some understanding about this, but Aucklanders have received very little information, certainly from the government and from the media. In decades past, our council, Auckland City Council and other councils, would have shown leadership on issues like this. And this is a hugely consequential issue. So we should be informing Aucklanders, and I would hope that the government sees this, so that they are in a position to act politically, because we know that this process is very much a political process. So people need to be informed so that there is a groundswell of action. I would suggest in respect of funding this that virtually every local board would be happy to put their hand in their pocket and find a very modest amount of money. And I would suggest that there would be any number of community groups across Auckland that would add to this groundswell so that Auckland Council is effectively leading a campaign, which is what we need to do. Otherwise, it's all blah, 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 and we're gutless. So are we going to act on the part of Aucklanders or not? Effectively, that means putting our money where our mouth is and crafting what may amount to some very simple advertisements that convey the message. What can be wrong with that? I would suggest it is entirely appropriate. It fits with every policy we have. It's Auckland having its say. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. So the motion before us, members, that we're speaking to at the moment is that we set aside a modest budget that's undefined to inform, that allocate a modest budget to inform Aucklanders of the consequences of this bill. Now it's just dropped, it's come back again. So a speaker to this, please. I believe the next speaker to this is Councillor Cooper, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I speak against this amendment for several reasons. One is the time frame, because we do ourselves no favour if we wind people up and then they don't have time to get their submissions in. I actually think that there is a select committee process that members of the public can go through. It's already there. We have our own comms where we'll often comment on, there may well be a press release about this that says Auckland Council is going to send its submission. We can put a link there where people can go and do that, and we can urge them to do that. I don't think that we have the time or the money to go out whipping up people. Enough people will be exercised by this as it is. We just need to put that in our normal channels and put the link to any select committee process.
Thanks, Councillor Cooper. Members, look, this looks really good. It looks like we're making sure that Aucklanders know about this, but we will not be in a position to inform Aucklanders fully on this. As I just mentioned earlier in the introduction of this amendment, our people are grappling to do the really important work, the work that makes a difference, to make this bill into something that is worthy to be applied in Auckland and the other cities around New Zealand, particularly the tier ones. We will not be in a position until at least late in the week of the 11th or the 12th, and then the submission period closes, and it closes sharp on the 16th. We just will not be there. Now, I've checked that with our staff. They need to be given the mandate to go ahead and do the real work that's necessary, that's going to create the best difference possible. Be constructive on this bill. We do not have the staff. We might find a little bit of budget, but I'm sure others would be contending that as well. This is a near impossible feat given the timelines. So it looks like we're all, if we were to vote this down, we're disenfranchising Aucklanders further, but it is just not realistic. Councillor Watson.
Yes, thanks. I do note, looking at this actual wording of the amendment, that it doesn't specify an exact time period, and it may well be that the most important period is that which actually follows the submission process. If this is largely, or at least in large part politically driven, which it is politically driven, because you couldn't look at the amount of housing supply that exists within Auckland, i.e. 900,000 homes, and say anything else. That supply is already there. So if it's about supply and it's about affordability, then we have both those things unraveling in opposite directions as it happens at the moment. One where we've got plentiful supply or potential supply, but affordability is going the other way. So there is something else to be considered here other than just encouraging people to cut up their sections or to sell to developers or whatever else that might occur right across the region. So if this is, as the Mayor said in his introductory remarks, a degree of political posturing, if I can use that term, then it's the battle for the public view that is important here, and that will come after the submission period has finished, which would make this amendment therefore highly relevant. I guess when it's all said and done, Mr. Chair, and it's easy to take these things in isolation, but I don't know about the rest of the councillors around here, but I'm starting to get a little wary of the number of reforms that are getting imposed, and I'm not looking to be overtly anti-government in this, but just the number. I'm more pro Auckland Council than anti-government, but in certainly as far as our standing as a council goes, the manner in which we're being perceived as something of a doormat to central government is one that is growing. I mean, I'm still answering emails about the water reforms. What is our position on the water reforms? So people still don't even realise that Auckland Council did take quite a strong contrary line, did stand up for their interest, and did articulate that. But that might have been fine. That might have been fine. That might have been fine within the walls of the town hall, but a little further outside it's not. And this is a very modest suggestion that we be a little bit more proactive, that we do state our position in a more articulate and meaningful fashion to our citizens. If we don't do it, we run the very real danger of having, lots of fruitful discussion within and amongst ourselves, but it doesn't go too much further than that. So to me, if, as indeed the presentations have suggested to us today, that this is sufficiently important and has sufficiently concerning consequences, then I think it would be entirely appropriate for us to do some degree of advertising to inform the public of our position, and so doing perhaps address a number of concerns that we'll be getting anyway, and perhaps most importantly to signal to the government that, well, belatedly, enough is enough, and Auckland Council is looking to make a bit of a stand on this one, and quite rightly so. If we don't, then that's taken as a degree of compliance and the steamroller will continue. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I now go to Councillor Simpson, please?
Thanks, Chair. Look, I think from my perspective, I support informing Aucklanders around the RMA bill. I'm not sure that I listened to Councillor Watson, and actually, it might not be that now is the time to do it, it might be later. So, of course, what this resolution does is it talks about urgency now. What you're saying is it won't work now because we've run out of time. And so I think if the intention, I think if the intention is to talk to Aucklanders about the RMA bill and give them the opportunity to have their say when and if it is their turn to have their say as part of more of the select committee process, I support that. But I can support that by doing things ourselves with respect to the Herald, advertising it in something like the Herald. We can use our Auckland, we can use our own channels, and the channels that we have as councillors to do that doesn't actually need any kind of a budget, because we have in-house ability to do that. So I absolutely support talking to Aucklanders about this, but I don't know that I would have I don't know that I will be able to, from my personal perspective, knowing that I won't even see what you've come up with until, say, the 11th. And then if we have feedback on what you've come up with and it's tweaked yet again over the weekend when we've all had a bit of time to look at it, it just might not work. So I think the amendment wants to, if it was a little bit more wide and talked about to inform Aucklanders about the likely consequences or whatever, that would be fine. But the fact that you can't define the budget and you can't get this information out now because we don't know what we're going to say yet, because we haven't even written the submission, it's just too premature.
Thank you, Councillor Simpson. I have now a comment from Councillor Fletcher, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm struggling a little bit with the amendment because I think it's just a bit general. What we've heard, with perhaps the exception of one or two, is some real concern about unintended consequences here. And I cannot recall such a significant change that would be fast-tracked to be getting the royal assent before Christmas. And people are going to, when changes occur next door to them, they're going to blame council. They are not going to be blaming the government or the opposition. It will be council's fault. And I think we do have an obligation to draw attention to those things that we've identified which are flaws. And the fact that we have, under the unitary plan, more than enough land for release. So I wonder whether the mover of the amendment could look at modifying it in some way. I don't think it should be an ad in the Herald. If we were to do something, I think we do have our own channels. I also am a great believer in the power of radio advertising, and we have specialists within council that can look at it. But if it is by the majority view of the council that we have severe misgivings about this reform, then I do think we have an obligation to tell Aucklanders about it. And it would be perhaps one of the responsibilities of the group that we're going to delegate authority to today, that they find ways to ensure that all Aucklanders have awareness of what is taking place at the moment. So rather than waiting for council to be blamed next year and beyond, I think we have an obligation to speak up now.
Thank you, Councillor. I will now go to Councillor Kuhn.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I am going to be quick. I wasn't going to speak to the substantive motion, but I will just quickly make a comment on this because I feel that the recommendations are very well drafted in terms of being able to pull together all of the issues that we've discussed on the bill, both good and bad, and how we're going to improve on it. Councillor Walker's amendment is just woolly and vague and unhelpful, and to talk about likely consequences, well, there's a whole range of what those consequences are. We've been canvassing those, we've been talking about them, to try to narrow them down to a pithy campaign within this very, very short consultation period is really impractical and unhelpful, and I just think we should get on and move the recommendations, which I think, you know, I think everyone is comfortable with where those recommendations are because of the way they've been drafted in a way that we can bring together a submission that canvasses a lot of the issues that have been raised, as well as, you know, we've got to highlight the positives of this bill as well, and the positives of intensification in the right places. So those points have got to be picked up as well. And I also am just surprised this hasn't been ruled out of order, but when it's seeking this committee to vote on a budget that's undetermined, unclear how much it is, and it would be a very irregular approach to a process. This is government's submission process. It's for the government to publicise the ability to submit on this, and we have our channels in which we do promote everything from our decisions on Three Waters, our input into a whole lot of government decision making. And if we start saying on an ad hoc basis that we're going to vote for a bit of budget here and a bit of budget there to do some kind of unclear advertising campaign that is pushing one particular viewpoint, which is not clear what that is, because who knows what does likely consequences mean when there are just so many potential consequences, both good and bad. So I just think, Mr. Chair, we should just, you know, let's just get this out of the way, and let's just put the substantive resolutions, and I'm very happy to support them, and I don't need to speak to them because I think they're drafted in a way that we can appreciate in a very short time frame. This submission's got to be turned around, and it does clear the way for staff to be able to bring together the comments they've heard today. And I don't envy those who've had this delegated to them, because it's going to be a very difficult task, but I'm sure that they're very capable of doing it, and also promoting to Aucklanders that we are putting feedback into this process. So thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to make that comment in opposing this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. And finally, to the amendment, Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. Just two really quick points. Yeah, look, I won't be supporting it either. I think Councillor Coombe has done a good job of representing my view as well. But I'd also add that, as per my comments just before, what we see as consequences of this bill will be disputed. We're not going to probably find one thing that we can universally represent as a council, because, as I've said before, I think there's a lot of positives here. Finally, I'd also say, look, as Deputy Chair of Finance, we need to justify every single expense in these difficult times. It needs to be clear and justified, and for that reason, it's just a bit woolly for me, although I do admire Councillor Walker's view that we should be seeking public information and public feedback. That's always a good thing, but I think not through this. So, thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair, may I withdraw the amendment?
Okay, thank you.
This council is gutless.
Sorry, can you withdraw that?
Point of order, please. Point of order. Can we please have that withdrawn?
Happy to withdraw.
Withdraw your comment, please, and apologise for calling us gutless.
Councillor Walker, you're withdrawing your amendment. I'd actually like you to withdraw the comment formally as well. Am I hearing that?
Immediately. I've withdrawn the comment.
Thank you. Okay, now we'll go back to the substantive motion, the motion that we were debating, and I'll go back to my speaking list. Kalinda, if you could help me, I believe it is Councillor Bartley. Councillor Bartley, your call, please.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to pick up on what Councillor Walker was saying about putting our money where our mouth is. And I reckon we should, especially in terms of what we say and what we have all agreed with the Auckland plan about belonging and participation, that all Aucklanders will be part of and contribute, have access to opportunities and the chance to develop to their full potential, like the opportunities for home ownership and the opportunities to live in a home. And I appreciate the comments that were made in the local board input about social inequity. And I hope that that will translate to support for the families that I deal with on a daily basis who are living in their garages, living in their cars, struggling to make ends meet, struggling to find somewhere to live because there's not enough private rentals that are even affordable, not enough houses. So, you know, and these people have jobs. They have jobs, they're working. So, you know, I really support these recommendations because it will enable more housing, and we need more housing. I want to pick up on the comments around uglification. And when you're living in your car, you don't mind if the house is ugly. I would argue that some houses are already ugly anyway. But yeah, if you're in your car, you just want to live in a house. And I think we lose that perspective because we're all doing pretty well ourselves. I want to also pick up on the developments. You know, my area already has a whole lot of multi-story developments on a zone or on a piece of land that was single house zone before. So I'm trying to understand how come those areas that have access to public transport, that have access to shops and jobs, don't have the same level of intensification that my area has had to undergo and that my residents have to put up with. So, you know, fair is fair. Why is it just in certain areas? So that is what I wanted to say about this. And also, from a personal note, I really hope that we can cut back on the use of these emotive words to try and draw some clickbait attention to really just poor form. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bartley, and I will now take the call of Councillor Simpson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'll keep this brief. We've been debating this for hours. Look, my comments are we spent, what was it, 100 million on the Auckland Unitary Plan, and it is still proving to be fine in so much it has delivered and will deliver for us future housing supply in our biggest city. I do support the advocacy from my local board. And I really appreciate the work that John Dogood and his team have put into where we are at. I have learned one thing, if I didn't know already, and I probably did, and that is it's no good saying no, stop it, don't do it, when it probably will happen anyway. And the best response to that is to keep at the table and debate and have evidence to help those who have started the process and have drafted the bill in its current form understand what our concerns are. So to that end, I do support putting a submission together as opposed to just saying no and saying it's not relevant, although I might personally feel that. And I do support actually having conversations, Mr. Chair, with some of the people who have signed up to the bill, and I know I have passed your details on to some of the members who have supported this bill from the government's perspective, and I hope that dialogue will be of some assistance to Auckland. Look, I'm hearing people who will love it. I'm hearing people who don't love it. But at the end of the day, I think as long as our submission has the evidence behind why it doesn't work so well for Auckland, I am also wondrously concerned around Auckland's point of difference not being acknowledged by Wellington, and that really does concern me. And I think as a council, we have to do better in that understanding for those in Wellington around where we have already, either by legislation or by the work we have done in the past, delivered on some of the outcomes that they may wish to be doing. So that's my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Simpson. I think we've sort of covered the ground well here. Are there other speakers on this, members? Look, just to round it out then, look, publicly I've had a bit to say on this, so I feel like I've taken my turn. But look, I think what aggrieves me here somewhat is the lack of collaboration with government on this. You know, we've got incredible planning resource right across the field to better inform this bill, and it was never taken advantage of. At no point did government reach out to us. At no point in our joint working party, and that's the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor, myself and Councillor Hills with the respective ministers, discussed this. We were very willing in responding to the MPSUD, including, you know, the carve out of a qualifying matter of special character area, and making sure we were well evidenced in that, not just rolling something over without evidence. You know, we were doing our very best to ensure that you know, what is delivered out of the MPSUD, more affordable, quality, and considerably greater number of houses in shorter timeframes was the outcome. But I think this almost somewhat knee-jerk reaction from government with this particular piece of legislation that they're proposing here has pulled the rug of confidence, not just, you know, politically. I think it's actually with our communities as well. There was a real willingness, some concerns about looking at the MPSUD and how it might apply, but I actually think we've got a much harder job to convince Aucklanders now because of this particular piece of legislation that's popped up. So members, we're going to have a reset in our relationship with government at the next joint working party meeting that the Mayor and Deputy Mayor and Councillor Hills and I attend, because that has to be top of the agenda there. But look, there's discussion about quality, there's discussion about infrastructure costs, all of that is going to have to be addressed. I think in about a week or so, we will have some really good evidence before us. I'm going to curtail my any further points because I think amongst this collective, and to avoid my builder's noise drowning you all out, I'll conclude it there. So members, we'll put this to the vote now. Could we take it on voices on all matters? And I will, it is moved and seconded. And now can I take the vote? All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. And to the contrary, no. Do I hear that that is carried unanimously? Is there any dissent?
Yes. Yes, unanimous.
There is dissent. Okay, it's carried. And
no,
members can notify.
No, Mr. Chairman, you misheard. Mr. Chairman, you misheard. I think people were saying yes, it was unanimous.
Thank you. It is carried unanimously. Members, I do apologise for the background noise. The builder is chasing me around my property, my house.